Hi, this is Candleberry, and I am here to read the next chapter of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I'm sorry I didn't do this yesterday. I'm a day late. But this is chapter 4 at Flourish and Blotts. And I'm going to focus it for a second because, there we go. Needs to be a little focused. So, to remind ourselves, remember what happened was that Harry has come to Ron's house at the Burrow. He is there with Ron's family, and even though they got in trouble, it's so much better than the Dursleys. He has never been in a wizarding house before, Harry, and this is really exciting for him. So now we're going to start at chapter 4 at Flourish and Blotts. Life at the Burrow was different as possible from life at Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered, and the Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece and it shouted, "Tuck in your shirt, Scruffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everyone there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat fourth helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with questions about life with muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say as Harry talked him through using the telephone. "Ingenious, really. How many days? How many ways muggles are fond of getting along without magic? How many ways muggles have found of getting along without magic? Excuse me." Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning, about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Jenny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Jenny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Jenny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered the room. Wonder why that is. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. There's Mrs. Weasley and Ron. "Letters from school," said, oh no, sorry, Ron Weasley. Ron Weasley. Sorry. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes on yellowish parchment addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You've got them too. You two've got them too," he added as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they all read their letters. Harry's told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on the September 1st. There was also a list of new books he'd be needing for the school year. Second grade students will require the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2 by Miranda Goshawk, Break with the Banshee by Gilderoy Lockhart, Guarding with Ghouls by Gilderoy Lockhart, Holiday with Hags by Gilderoy Lockhart, Travels with Trolls by Gilderoy Lockhart, Voyages with Vampires by Gilderoy Lockhart, Wanderings with Werewolves by Gilderoy Lockhart, Year with the Yeti by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all of Lockhart's book too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George, with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "We'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Jenny's things second-hand." "Oh, are you studying at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Jenny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair. and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except for Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother, Percy, walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning, all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again immediately, pulling from underneath him a molten gray feathered duster. At least that's what Harry thought it was, until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting the letter from under his wing. "Finally! He's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch inside the back door and tried to stand on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron had laid him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it aloud. "Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there, I hope everything went all right and Harry is okay, and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out. Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've really been worried if Harry is all right. Will you please let me know at once, but perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course." "How can she be?" said Ron in horror. "We're on holiday." "And we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love, from Hermione." "Well, that fits nicely. We can go get all of your things then too," said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. "What are you all up to today?" Harry, Ron, Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock in the Weasley zone. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples to each other to catch. They took it in turns to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. Ooh, that's slow. 5 minutes later, they were marching uphill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he said he was busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtime so far. He stayed in his room the rest of the time. I wish I knew what he was up to," said Fred, frowning. "He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did. 12 OWLs, and hardly gloated at all." "Ordinary wizarding levels," George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. "Bill got 12 too, but if we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame." Pause, and you can decide for yourself, is being head boy something that they should be ashamed of? Good question. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt, working for the Wizards' Bank, Gringotts. "Don't know how Mom and Dad are going to afford all of our school stuff this year," said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Jenny needs robes and a wand and everything." Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had any money, so you couldn't use galleons, sickles, and nuts in Muggles' shops. He had never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with the magic world would stretch to a pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all up early the following Wednesday. After a quick half a dozen bacon sandwiches each, they each had 6 bacon sandwiches. They pulled on their coats, and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. "We're running low, Arthur," she said. "We'll have to buy some more today." "Oh, well, guess first after you, Harry, dear." She offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them, all watching him. "What am I supposed to do?" he stammered. He's never traveled by Floo powder," said Ron suddenly. Oh, no, he said it suddenly. I gotta reread that. "He's never traveled by Floo powder," said Ron suddenly. "Sorry, Harry, I forgot." "Never," said Mr. Weasley. "But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your things last year?" "I went on the underground." "Really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Well, they're escapators. How exactly?" "Not now, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear. But goodness me, if you've never used it before, he'll be all right." "He'll be all right, Mum," said Fred. "Harry, watch us first." He took a pinch of the glittering powder out of the flowering pot, stepped into the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the flames turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouting, "Diagon Alley!" and vanished. "You must speak clearly, dear," Mrs. Weasley told Harry, as George dipped his hand in the flower pot. "And mind you don't get out the right grate." "The right what?" said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. "Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know. But as long as you've spoken clearly—" "He'll be fine, Molly. Don't fuss," said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder too. "But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain it to his aunt and uncle?" "They wouldn't mind," Harry reassured her. "Dudley would think it was brilliant. It would be a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that." "Well, all right. You go after Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And keep your elbows tucked in," Ron advised. "And your eyes shut," said Mrs. Weasley. "The soot." "And don't fidget," said Ron, "or it might well fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George." Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze, and he opened his mouth immediately and swallowed a lot of hot ash. Diagon Alley," he coughed. It felt as though he was being sucked down a giant plug hole. It's like a plug hole is kind of like the hole in your sink or your bathtub. Drain hole is what we might call it. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, spinning and spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through his glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces, and snatched glimpses of rooms beyond. Glimpses of rooms beyond his bacon sandwiches were churning inside him. So this is how we're going to pause. We're churning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then he fell face forward onto a cold stone floor and felt his glasses shatter. So again, here is kind of what Jim K, excuse me, our illustrator feels like his idea of what the Floo powder feels like. So here's Harry traveling through the Floo powder. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got up gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in the stone fireplace of what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop. But nothing in here was ever likely to be on the Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withered hand on a cushion, a blood-stained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks leered down from the walls. An assortment of human bones lay upon the counter, and rusty spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow alley Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. So there's Harry kind of here. You can kind of see him peeking out from behind something, right? No sooner had he got out, the sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging where it had hit the hearth, Harry made his way swiftly and silently towards the door. But before he got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass, and one of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot, and wearing broken glasses. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside it and pulled the door. Excuse me. He shot inside it and pulled the doors to, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man who followed could only be his father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold, gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop looking lazily at the items on display and rang the bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not What's the good of that if I'm not in the house tea?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got a Nimbus 2000 last year. Special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart. Wonderful Potter, with his scar and his broomstick." You have already told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy with a quelling look at his son, "and I would remind you that it's not prudent to appear fond. It's not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter. Not when most of our kind regard him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borgin in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy too, charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you, just in today, and very reasonably priced." "We're not buying anything today, Mr. Borgin, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling." The smile faded from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from inside his pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Borgin to read. "I have a few items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Borgin fixed a pincers on his to his nose and looked down at the list. Those are those little glasses things, just so you know. "The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, surely." Mr. Malfoy's lip curled. "I have not been visited yet." "The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect, yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumors about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt that flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it." Harry felt a hot surge of anger. "And as you see, Certain of these poisons might make it appear. I understand, sir, of course, said Mr. Morgan. Let me see. Can I have that? Interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on his cushion. Ah, a hand of glory, said Mr. Berrigan, abandoning Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. Insert a candle, and it gives light to only the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir. I hope my son will amount to more than a thief or a plunderer, Borgin, said Mr. Malfoy coldly, and Mr. Borgin said quickly, No offence, sir, I meant no offence. Though if his school marks don't pick up, said Malfoy more coldly still, that indeed may all he is fit for. It's not my fault, retorted Draco. The teachers have favourites, but Hermione Granger. I would have thought you'd be ashamed that a girl of no wizard family beat you in every exam, snapped Malfoy. Ah, said Harry under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both abashed and angry. It's the same all over, said Mr. Borgin in his oily voice. Wizard blood is counting. Less everywhere. Not with me, said Mr. Malfoy, his long nostrils flaring. No, sir, nor with me, said Mr. Borgin in a deep, low bow. In that case, perhaps we can return to my list, said Mr. Malfoy shortly. I'm in something of a hurry. Borgin, I've important business elsewhere today. They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew nearer and nearer to its hiding place, examining the objects for sale. He paused to examine a long coil of hangman's rope and to read, smirking, the card propped on the magnificent necklace of opals. Caution, do not touch. Curse has claimed the lives of 19 Muggle owners to date. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward and stretched his hand out for the handle. Done, said Mr. Malfoy at the counter. Come, Draco. Harry wiped his forehead on his sleeves as Draco turned away. Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I'll expect you at the manor tomorrow to pick up the goods. The moment the door had closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manners. So he changed as soon as Mr. Malfoy left, right? Good day yourself, Mr. Malfoy. Mr. Malfoy. And if the stories are true, you haven't sold me half of what's hidden in your manor. Ooh. So basically, Mr. Borgin is saying, well, if the rumors I hear are true, you haven't told me nearly all the bad stuff that you've got in your house. Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared into a back room. Harry waited for a minute in case he came back. Then, quietly as he could, slipped out of the cabinet, past the glass cases, and out the front, and out the door of, and out the shop door. So this is what it looks like outside. Yeah. There's the kind of, I have to do it this way because of the light. But there's what the shop window of Borgin and Burke's looks like. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, so you can see how broken they are. He's got us over here. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, oh look, here we go. He stared around. He had emerged into the dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up of entirely shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he'd just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down, a large cage was alive with the gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadow of the doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight and hoping against hope he'd be able to find his way out of there. An old wooden street sign hanging over a shop selling potions and candles told him it was Nocturne Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoke clearly enough through his mouthful of ashes back at the Weasley's fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. Not lost, are you, dear? Said a voice in his ear, making him jump. Jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked like holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingernails. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. I'm fine, thanks, he said. I'm just Harry. What do you think you're doing down there? Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascaded down her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding towards them, beetle black eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. Hagrid! Said Harry croaked in relief. I was lost. Flea powder. Hagrid seized Harry by the scruff of the neck and pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyway, out into the bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him right into Diagon Alley. You're a mess, said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off of Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside the apothecary. Skulking around Nocturne Alley. I don't know. Dodgy place. Hurry. Don't want no one to see you down there. I realize that, said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made him brush off again. I told you I was lost. What were you doing down there anyway? I was looking for a flesh-eating slug repellent, growled Hagrid. They're ruining the school cabbages. You're not on your own. I'm staying with the Weasleys. But we've got separated, Harry explained. I've got to find them. And they set off together down the street. How come you never wrote back to me? Said Hagrid, as Harry jogged on alongside of him. He had, look at all the shops. So cool. So I'm going to let you look at the different kinds of shops. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. I'm going to pause there so that I can read to you what all of these buildings say. This one says robes. This one says quills, pigments, paints, powders, dyes, tinctures, inks. It's called Krakens. This one says quality Quidditch supplies, top togs for chasers, beaters, keepers, seekers. This doesn't say. It's hard to read. This is like a little, it says something leeches, beaches, leeches. Everything sucks but our service. This says the 3 sheets. This says down the hatch. Bats, bats, bats. And then it says Nolkins for skulls and skins. This says burning balls, fireworks. And that says Mr. Mim's kite maker, so that explains that. And this says Crispa, although you can't see it, which you'll see in a little while. I'll move it over. Then this one says Crispa cold peppers, drugs and preparations. And this one says nails, bells. So, now I'm going to finish reading. And when I get to this page, I'll move it over so you can hopefully see more of the picture. I'm not going to put my finger on it because if I do that, you won't be able to see the picture as well. So I'm going to let you guys enjoy the illustrations. Okay? Running Muggles, growled Hagrid. If I'd have known. Harry, over here! Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing at the top of a white flight of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her bushy brown hair flying behind her. Oh, what happened to your glasses? Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry? As soon as I found the Weasleys, said Harry. Well, you don't have long to wait, grinned Hagrid. So here we go. Harry and Hermione looked around. Sprinting up the crowded streets were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry, Mr. Weasley panted. We'd hope you'd only go 1 grade too far. He mopped his glistening bald patch. Molly's frantic. She's coming now. Where did you come out? Ron asked. Nocturne Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Brilliant, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed to go in, said Ron. We've never been allowed to go in, said Ron enviously. I should really think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand, and Jenny clinging on to the other. Oh, Harry! Oh, my dear! You could have been anywhere! Gasping for breath. Oh, here's some more. So I'm going to pause there. You could have been anywhere. And I'll read to you these shop names so that you can look at them while I finish. So this one says Mandrake Mufflers, Shrew and Skulls, Bridals, Wear, Grandma Gramercy's, Gramophones, I don't know, Gaberloonce's, Slap Up Tog, and Out Kixie's Builder Garments, Trotter Class, and Upper Benjamin's. I don't know what that means. That must be English, an English phrase. This says old known books, unique, unquiet. Ghosts, specters, shades, apparitions. And then this says Mr. Trismus, mouth magician, toothmonger. Herbert's Sherbets is underneath there. So you can go get your sweets and then you can come up to get your teeth taken care of. This says Morning Star Armors. This says, I can't read it because it's in the. This says Cats. Marcus Minkus Myomancer. This says The Magic Lantern. Deathlight Storm Lanterns and Fire Fairies. This says Caput Mortium. Ooh, doesn't look very nice. Lots of skeletons. It says the articulator of bones, preserver of animals. And then here it says Flail and Hide, Boogermongers. Ha ha! Flail and Hide, Furriers. And then it says Trapped Snares, Pages, and I can't read it. It's too little for this camera. Okay, sorry. I hope that you weren't as I was looking. Sorry. All right. So there you go. These are these shops. Why don't you look and enjoy all the special little parts, if you can, of these illustrations while I continue reading this page, and then I'll move it over. Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot Hagrid hadn't managed to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap of his wand, and returned them, good as new. Well, good to be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand rubbed by Mrs. Weasley. No, Nocturne Alley, if you hadn't found him, Hagrid. See ya at Hogwarts. And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed street. Guess who I saw at Borgin and Burke's? Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed in the Gringotts steps. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. No, he was selling. So he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with a grim satisfaction. Oh, I love to get Lucius Malfoy for something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply, as they were ushered into the bank by a bowing goblin at the door. That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. I'm going to move this all the way over so you can see this page. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy? Said Mr. Weasley indignantly. Oh, I've got to say it indignantly. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy? Said Mr. Weasley indignantly. But he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. Ah, but you're muggles, said Mr. Weasley, delighted. We must have a drink. What's? We must have a drink. What's? That you've got there. Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look! He pointed excitedly to the 10-pound notes in Mr. Granger's hands. That's like saying he's pointing to like $10 bills. Okay. Meet you back here, Ron said to Hermione as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to their underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin. The vaults were reached by means of small goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Nocturne Alley when it was open. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into her bag. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view, but he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into a leather bag. So pause and think about why does Harry feel so bad? I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong, right? But back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Jenny were going to the second-hand robe shop, and Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll meet at Flourish and Blotts in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Nocturne Alley," she shouted at the twins' retreating backs. Harry and Ron and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobbled streets. The bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pocket was clamoring to be spent, so that he bought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at a full set of Chudley Cannon's robes in the windows of Quality Quidditch Supplies until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door. In Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous Wet Start, no heat fireworks. And in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, wonky brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy, deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gained Power. Ooh, of course. A study of Hogwarts prefects and their latter careers. Ron read out loud off the back cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. "Course, he's very ambitious, Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be the Minister of Magic," Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blotts. They were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshop. As they approached, they saw to their surprise a large crowd jostling outside the doors trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today from 12:30 to 4:30 p.m. "We can actually meet him," Hermione squeals. "I mean, he's written almost the whole book list." The crowd seemed to be made up mostly of witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Comely ladies, don't push there. Now mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside the shop where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of Break with the Banshee and sneaked up to the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Mrs. Weasley, sounding breathless, and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart slowly came into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flash-dazzling white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue, which exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard hat was set on a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke at every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This one's for the Daily Prophet." Big deal, said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up, saw Ron, and then saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter." The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Oh. Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet, what an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry Potter here stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now, free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip down to the end of his nose, "that he would shortly be getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolfellows will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. In fact, yes, ladies and gentlemen, it announced, I have the great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room where Jenny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books in the cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "But you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. Let's all sneer. "Famous Harry Potter. Can't even go to a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone." "Oh no. Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Jenny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, got yourself a girlfriend?" drawled out Malfoy. Potter, got yourself a girlfriend? Drawled out Malfoy. Jenny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching a stack of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, hey?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for that lot." Ron nearly went as red as Jenny. He dropped his books into the cauldron too, and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George, "what are you doing? It's mad in here. Let's go outside." "Well, well, well, Arthur Weasley." It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering in just the same way. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the Ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Jenny's cauldron and extracted from amidst the glossy Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," he said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't pay you well for it?" So here, Mr. Malfoy is saying that Mr. Weasley is a disgrace. See if you agree with him. Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizards, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into a bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spell books came thundering down all over their head. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrinking. "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backwards, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please!" cried the assistant, and then louder than all of them, "Break it up there, gents, break it up." Hagrid was wading toward them through a sea of books. In an instant he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Jenny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here you go. Take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You could have just ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core, the whole family. Everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Now come on, let's get out of there. Here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them from leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example to set for your children. Brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all about publicity." But it was a subdued group who headed back to the fireside in the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street, and on the other side, Mr. Weasley started to ask them how the bus stop worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. And so there we go. Lots of stuff happened. How would you feel if you were one of the Weasleys and your dad started fighting in a bookshop? Would you be embarrassed? Would you be cheering him on? Would you be frightened and worried? Good things to think about. Our next chapter, chapter 5, I will post tomorrow on Friday, is called The Whomping Willow. We'll find out what that means later.